Hi students, Professor Matt here. Today's lecture is on new criticism and formalist analysis. Now before we begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about theory versus criticism. So when we talk about literary theory, theory involves defining what literature is, who an author is, and how readers make meaning. And of course these are very broad and general questions that might seem at first very easy to answer, but it's sort of like opening the proverbial can of worms that once you start to dig deeper into these things, the more elusive that they become. Criticism, on the other hand, involves questions of why we care about literature, evaluation of literary works, and whether they are good or bad. So coming up with some set of criteria or form of analysis whereby we can judge them. Now the history of theory and criticism follows a trajectory that the ideas of literature are formed primarily by three different things. And the first phase involves the idea that literature is primarily formed by language, so it's a study of linguistics. The second phase involves literature as formed primarily by the human psyche, and here we see the influence of psychoanalysis. In the third phase, we see literature as being understood primarily through social, economic, and historical forces. Another definition, hermeneutics, is the art of interpretation, and hermeneutics becomes necessary when the meaning of a text is important and simultaneously that meaning is difficult to discern. Some might say that theory is useful in and of itself, but others might argue that theory is useful to the extent that it informs criticism and helps put those theories into practice. Many of you might be unfamiliar with different literary theories, schools of criticism, but if you've taken a literature course and not been defined as having been taught a certain theory, then probably what you've been doing is a form of formalist theory. And formalism is the oldest school of theory. It dates all the way back to Aristotle's book Poetics, which was an argument against Plato's notion that poetry imitates reality badly. The Greek word here for imitation is mimesis. And Aristotle was arguing that poets are not so much imitating reality as they are reconstructing it. Plato's emphasis had been, on the other hand, that of the harmful effects of poetry and drama on society because they were seen as misleading imitations of truth. And Aristotle's counterargument was that poetry presents things not as they are, but as they should be. New criticism is a specific school of formalism that begins in the 1930s. And the new critics focused on very close readings of a text, and they helped to revolutionize the literature classroom by demonstrating that the study of literature was far more than just recitation and appreciation. The new critics picked up on the philosopher Kant's term, the purposeful versus the purpose of. And in looking at experiencing objects or text as being pleasant or unpleasant versus thinking about those texts on more cognitive grounds. So the text as purpose of means that the text has meaning unto itself, rather than simply saying the text brings me pleasure or it doesn't bring me pleasure, and I'm going to use that as sort of the measure or the criteria by which I evaluate a text, whether it does something for me, and saying rather, what is the text trying to do on its own terms? And the new critics would study the text as having meaning unto itself, looking at its internal coherence, looking at its organization, looking at its complexity. And as such, the readers begin to appreciate the work on its own terms, right? Again, not because they have any selfish interest, the text is going to bring me pleasure or displeasure. That would be instrumental interest. In the new critical tradition, the realization that we can appreciate objects, or we could substitute that with other people, without having the instrumental interests, those selfish designs, is it bringing me pleasure or not, is really foundational to our value as independent moral agents. And so the freedom of the literary text from our own desires, our own selfish designs, is really the moral basis of integrity in the formalist tradition. And it establishes a real sense of ethics from a formalist perspective. Now, modernist writers like T.S. Eliot helped to create what's called the literary canon. The canon is an exclusive list of works or authors that are worthy of critical study. Now, John Crowe Ransom was the figure who coined the term new criticism. And this was a school of formalism that was going against two traditions of literary scholarship in academia at the time. One of those being philology, which is the Greek word for the love of words. and essentially is a study of linguistics and literature in historical context. And by the 1930s, literary scholars had established a canon of literature that included nearly everything that mattered. And of course, this would involve Chaucer, Milton, Shakespeare, kind of those key foundational, what we call canonical authors. The second tradition against which the new critics were formed is the notion of appreciative teaching. So the idea that we should just memorize, recite, and applaud really great literature by those canonical authors, and maybe throw in a few choruses of Kumbaya. So the new critics came along and preached that we need to focus on close readings of the text. We need to focus on the unity of the work, which includes both its coherence and its complexity. A few of the other mantras of the new critics were the heresy of the paraphrase, which is to say that it's really not adequate that we could summarize or paraphrase a text because it speaks for itself. And any attempt to do so is to diminish the originality of the text. The new critics also warned of the intentional and the effective fallacies. The intentional fallacy was the belief that we can't trust the intentions of the author. So it was a new critic's way of kind of dismissing the role of the author in the task of making meaning of literature. And the effective fallacy was a way of the new critics doing away with the notion of the reader. So the readers, how a text might emotionally move a reader is something that the new critics wanted to push past through. So you push through that emotional response and you get to deep dish analysis of the text itself. So if we look at the major players in the function of literature, we have the author, we have the text, and we have the reader. The new critics are going to put the primary emphasis on the text. Doing away with the author through the intentional fallacy, doing away with the reader through the effective fallacy. So in this sense, the new critics put forward the notion of universal meaning, that text can have meaning beyond its time and culture, beyond its historical context. And of course, the assumption there is that there's some sort of ideal reader who can decode the text and understand all these literary devices. Another legacy of the new criticism is the idea that terms such as short story, poem, novel, documentary, etc. are themselves formal distinctions. So this is how you probably have been practicing some form of formalism anytime you've studied literature, because these are accepted terms that come from a formalist tradition. Now, Russian formalism actually came before new criticism. And the Russian formalists were interested in what they call literariness, or the devices of literature, and the way that authors deploy these devices in text to impede the reader's arrival at meaning and alter the reader's understanding of meaning. So it's a way of using language in a artistic or literary sense to have a certain sense of style. And attempts to articulate the literary studies in scientific terms was a way of trying to justify that literature has a place in academia alongside other disciplines like biology and calculus, because of course it has its own set of terms, it has its own set of devices that warrant its study. Russian formalist looks at literary history as a sequence of changes in which literary devices struggle to become the dominant device that motivates or preselects devices in a given textual field. Of course, this has a sort of Darwinian ring to it. We have a sort of struggle or survival of different literary devices that are trying to beat one another out. The Russian formalist also talked about the concept of defamiliarization, which is similar to Ezra Pound's injunction to make it new, which in a sense makes the notion of defamiliarization a transnational concept or idea. But defamiliarization is taking something that is really familiar to us and making it new, or making it strange in a way. And literature could do this by causing us to think about, really simple things in ways that we don't always think about them. The Russian formalists make a distinction between form and content, and the arguments put forward that in attempting to isolate something as content, it turns out at the bottom to be a device among other devices. And of course, here we have that sort of Darwinian notion of the struggle of devices to become the dominant mode. And we can chart the difference between evolution or modification of form. Evolution being sort of a more organic way that literary devices develop. So they're responding to other impulses at the time, and they either become accepted into the larger culture, the field of devices, or they do not. They kind of pass on. versus modification of form is when you have someone like Stalin who comes in and says you must write Stalinist realism. Of course, it doesn't say it as such, but the idea is that if you're not producing socialist propaganda, then you're not allowed to write. And so here we have the intervention of some political, historical figure that modifies the form in that way, censorship or propaganda. Some of the key principles of formalism. One is that the aesthetic experience is unique, powerful, and significant. Formalist tradition, we're going to focus again more on form, more on the text. In the new critical tradition, we have the idea of universal truth of a text and the possibility of enlightenment. Again, we're focusing on the text rather than the reader, so the affective fallacy is a way of doing away with the emotional responses that a reader has to literature, and we're pushing past that to be able to read a text on its own terms. The second key principle is that literature has formal aspects that distinguish it clearly from other types of expression. And so we have, in the sense, the constructed nature of the literary work. The construct itself is meaningful, and we understand that literature as a written word is different than, say, your shopping or your grocery list, right? That too could be a written word, but we generally don't define a shopping list as literature. However, if you took a shopping list and published it in a book of poetry, then suddenly we see that the lines start to get a little bit fuzzy or blurry, right? And that's where we go back to some of those original questions about the nature of theory, is it asks those general questions. What is literature? Is the shopping list literature if I've written it down on a piece of paper and I take it to the grocery store? Probably not. But if I publish that in a journal of poetry, does that suddenly make it literature? So there's sort of interesting questions to explore there. The third key principle is literature can be usefully subdivided into genres. We can think of genres, very broadly as prose versus poetry. We can also think of genres within fiction, right? We have literary fiction, we have romance fiction, detective fiction, science fiction, etc. And so there's a variety of ways we can look at the notion of genre, but there are certain rules or typify certain genres. The fourth key principle is that literary analysis has its own specific interests, focuses in terminology that differentiate it from the fields of history, psychology, and sociology, etc. So these are all distinct disciplines that you can study in academia. The fifth key principle is that literature has meaning beyond the intent and biography of the author. So again, this is the new critic's notion of the intentional fallacy. We need to move beyond just what the author intended the work to mean, because writers are not always consciously aware of what they're doing. They don't always understand all the aspects of their work or all the ways that meaning can be constructed from their work. And of course, intentions can be very misleading. So an author might have intended his or her work to mean one thing, but the outcome could be very different from that intention. The sixth key principle is that close reading and attention to form, language, and detail are key to discussion of literature's qualities, themes, and functions. And we're going to talk about a lot of different methodologies in this course, but all of them are going to share this key principle in common, is that we need a close reading of the text. We need judicious examples to help support our ideas, our generalizations, our conclusions. And this notion can be traced back to the formalist tradition. Of course, the new critical tradition is instrumental in focusing on these close readings, on careful detail, and on using examples to support your ideas. So this is Professor Matt signing off until next time.